My name is Isabelle McConville, and I am a bookseller and producer here at Barnes& Noble. And today I am so excited to be here with Stephanie Wambugu, debut author of Lonely Crowd. It's got this gorgeous,
Hello.
gorgeous cover. How was it like to see your book in my hand right now?
I mean, it's so strange. I've seen photos on the internet, of course, but even handing like a galley to a friend is so bizarre. I mean, it's strange that it's like a commodity and really exists now. I now have hardcovers, so I'm seeing even an even realer, version. But yeah, it's strange. It's a good feeling, I guess.
Amazing. I can't wait to get my own hardcover. This is definitely one that I'm buying multiple copies of just because I
No,
want to
thank
get it
you.
in people's hands. Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. And also, I will say it wasn't a book that I read in a single sitting, even though I was tempted to,
Mhm.
just because this ended up being the kind of book that I like to savor and I never want to end. So I have some types of books like that where I'm reading it and I'm reading it really quickly because I'm loving it. And then I kind of pause and I'm like, wait, I want to live in this world as long as I can. So I kept putting it off and I was like, I'm going to read one chapter tonight, only one. And then I finished it just because I never wanted it to end.
Oh, that's so kind. Thank you.
Yes, of course. So, can you please give us an introduction to this book and its characters?
Yes. So I mean, it has a. I realize now, rereading it, it has a sort of bigger cast than I realized because I think most of the interviews or conversations I've had about it, it's about the central friendship in the book, which is
Right.
between the narrator, who is a woman named Ruth, and when the novel begins, like she's like approaching her 40s, but she's looking back on an earlier period of her life. It goes kind of immediately back to her childhood and right before she begins school. And she attends this Catholic all girls school and she receives a scholarship to go there. And she meets her friend, which ends up being the kind of it's like the dynamic that animates the whole novel. She meets this friend named Maria. And so those are the two central characters. Although it's narrated by Ruth, I think it's just as concerned with Maria and her development. And they have fairly parallel lives. So the girls go to this Catholic school together. They end up going to the same college. It's not really spoiling anything. This is
Yeah.
all. This context is apparent from the beginning. But they end up going to this school together called Bard, which is where I went to school. Although it's not autofictional, they basically just go off to art school together, and then from there their paths kind of diverge, but it follows them through these like parallel kind of like coming of age stories. And just before we started speaking, we talked about how it was a campus novel. I spoke with a
Hmm.
friend of mine who described it as sort of like a twinned campus novel or double campus novel, and that it has like
Oh,
the Catholic school and then the other, stark contrast with the art school that they end up going to. And then it's also a lot of it is concerned with Ruth's parents, with Maria's guardian. She doesn't really have a parent, but yeah, and then their teachers and other sort of like romantic interests. And so I think each chapter, it's sort of like there's a bit of like a shuffling in and out of new characters, and but I'd say like Ruth and Maria are the most important of characters in the novel.
and Ruth pretty much instantly became one of my favorite characters just because her voice was so distinct and I just felt like I was truly in her head, which I love when a book can do that, when I truly feel like I'm living in the book. Can you talk a little bit about how you really like formed that voice?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when I moved to New York, I was living in the Hudson Valley and I moved to New York to start grad school to do my MFA. And right when I started school, I just started to hear the voice of like this first person narrator who was, a bit older than I was, but was kind of talking about her early life. And it was sort of like this jaded, she's a little bit cynical, like she has a sort of flat affect, but then I think she also is genuinely like curious about her childhood, and she's able to slip back into this consciousness that's more like that of a child, and
Mhm.
she has this kind of naivete at the same time. Even though she's like become this sort of like worldly and more sophisticated person, she has these moments where she is really like can be incredibly earnest and is just kind of like a vessel or a repository for everything going on around her. And I think that was that's sort of what I wanted, the tension I wanted to explore with her voice, and that she's very like aloof and sort of standoffish, but then at the same time has this like like this openness and this earnestness that I think is more like a child, and she kind of oscillates between those two like those two sensibilities.
Yeah, I know you said that you came to her voice, like, or her voice came to you just out of the blue. Was that really what sparked the entire creation of this novel?
Basically, I mean, I wanted to write a novel about an artist because initially I thought maybe it could be set just in the moment after the period of Black Lives Matter that was after the death of George Floyd, because at that moment there was so much increased representation. There was increased representation of Black visual artists. And the book, my novel, is kind of concerned with that too, but it's not so explicitly set in like a historical moment. Although, you know, it's clear that it's in the late 80s and 90s. I didn't want it to feel dated or too bound to contemporary events or like ripped from the headlines. And also, I worried that would just be replicating what I worried about, which was that when there's a sort of like a mass, like a tragedy that's like co-opted by a group or by a collective, that the recourse maybe shouldn't be, you know, artists being like mouthpieces for, you know, other people and sort of like commandeering other people's suffering. So I thought, you know, maybe it would be it's like, you know, setting it in the 90s is maybe good because I don't have to respond to this immediate cultural moment. But so anyway, yeah, so partially I wanted to write about those kinds of questions. But then also, I think I have this with any piece of fiction I write. The voice has to come more or less fully formed to me. And when I write a piece of like short fiction, it's almost like in an instant that I know who the speaker will be, how it will end. It feels like if you sit down and are open, like more or less, you can just, something comes fully formed. Of course, like I wrote it over the course of years, and like a few years, and drafted it many times, and the edits were rigorous, but it felt like Ruth came as a fully formed person. And that was always her name, and it was always set where it's set, and so.
That's so interesting to me because I just going back to what you said about thinking about placing it in, you said 2019, 2020, right?
Yeah.
That makes me think about a scene in the book where someone tells Ruth, like, oh, Black art is very in right now.
Yeah.
And she's just like, she doesn't know how to take that. And so I love that you kind of still incorporated that into the novel in a way. Yeah. And we also have Maria, who's Ruth's best friend. Did you have a process for discovering her voice and like fleshing her out as a character as well?
Yeah, I think that was more like she accumulated more gradually, and that like she was always a character, and she was always a bit of a foil because they go to this school that's very, very white. The reason why they are able to attend the school is because they get these scholarships from the church, that the church like allocates a couple of scholarships every year for girls to attend this Catholic school, or like their diocese gave them the scholarships. And so I guess the idea was to include Maria to show that Ruth is maybe not the only one. There's one other person, but it's not as though there was going to be this like intense closeness and solidarity between them in the first drafts. And it's only as I continued to write, I just became more and more interested in Maria and like how they could be foils, and also like the way that maybe had they encountered one another in another context where there was, you know, plenty of choice and like plenty of diversity or people from various cultures, they might not have even had any contact. Like I think it's the fact that they are set apart by their race that initially pushes them into proximity. I think for Ruth, it was just genuine. It's like the ineffable thing of like, why are you so drawn to a person? You can't really know in that initial encounter. But I do think part of it is that when you're very isolated and you see someone else who maybe externally appears to like share, you know, is part of the same racial group or like has some sort of commonality with you, you're forced into proximity with them. And so I think that maybe that's sort of a question in the book too, is like, had they been born 20 years later, had they been born into a more like diverse area, would they even have had any interest in one another at all? And so I thought that was interesting too, that it's so like it was kind of arbitrary that they would have such a close bond, but it ends up being like very consequential for both of them.
Absolutely. I mean, it makes you question so many things, like how much of our identity is shaped by where we're from and the people around us. And I love the way that you explored that in the book. And also in the opening paragraph of the book, you write, "When I met Maria, I learned that without an obsession, life was impossible to live." That line just knocked me on the ground. I love that line, that opening paragraph specifically. I mean, it gives us the tension right away. It gives us a glimpse into Ruth's mind right away. Can you talk a little bit about writing that?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly enough, a lot of that language was in earlier drafts, but the whole first chapter is basically the last thing that I wrote.
Wow.
Writing the novel. So I played with like many, because it always was meant to open with Ruth looking back. So not open in childhood, but open in adulthood, and then immediately kind of have become sort of retrospective after that. But yeah, I mean, I think that's in some ways it's like the thesis of the book. Not that a novel like needs to have a thesis, but I think it's only once I had really written everything else that I was able to distill what was important to Ruth, or how Ruth would talk about what is even the nature of my relationship with this woman. Is maybe like it's only something you can know after the fact. So I think it makes sense that it was written so late in this stage of writing the novel. And yeah, I mean, I guess when I wrote it, I thought, like, is it okay to be this explicit and say so explicitly, like, this is just because I think the impulse is to conceal some of those feelings and like not address them head on. But I thought with someone who's can be so like repressed and evasive, like Ruth, maybe it would be interesting to open in this register where she's just saying outright, like, this was the most important person in my life, and it is the most important person in my life, and in some ways, my story is kind of her story, and I can't really tell the story of my life without foregrounding her, you know?
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. That line just really struck me because it reminds me too, like you were talking about repression, that's also how it can feel when you have a crush on someone, right? Like it just totally, and which is a different type of like obsession, infatuation, and it will totally just dominate your thought process, like maybe what you wear that day, or like where you're going to go get your coffee that day, or like if you're going to see someone in a hallway, like you're hoping to see that person. So I thought it was really interesting that you start the book out in that way, because like you said, it just puts us right there in the action. And I'd love to talk also about the book's epigraph, the Franz Kafka quote.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When I think about it, I must say that my education has done me great harm in some respects. Can you talk about choosing that, how it relates to your novel, and just why you wanted to start the book with that?
Okay, well, for one thing, I think that it's kind of funny because I feel like Kafka, I mean, to countless other writers, like one of the most important writers, I think truly a genius, like completely. I was reading this Deborah Eisenberg essay about Kafka in the New York Review of Books, which I'd highly recommend. And I think one line, I'll butcher it because it was so, like, it was written in such a precise way, and it was this incredible, like, character study of Kafka, and kind of just like his mystery and like how mysterious his work is. And I think that there's a central mystery in Kafka that to me is so like aspirational and brilliant, that you can come to the end of a story and it feels so satisfying, but there's still not, it's not like you were able to like penetrate the central question or like strangeness of his fiction. So anyway, I'll say that about his fiction and like what Kafka means to me. But I think it's interesting that he would say my education has done me great harm, because and that's a refrain in his diaries. He feels like thwarted by his teachers, or like they had a really negative effect on him. And for someone as brilliant as Kafka to say, I'm sort of a victim of my education, it made me think, like, what about the rest of us, you know? And so also, I mean, I found that epigraph. I was reading the Kafka Diaries in Columbia's library where I was a student doing my MFA. And as soon as I read the line, I just thought that this is the epigraph. Like it was immediately felt applicable, felt like a bit of an index in the way that I think an epigraph can be helpful, like an index or like a thematic index for the book, or like a way of, yeah, I don't know. It just feels like it has this like faded connection with the narrative that I just stumbled upon it one day and thought it was perfect. And then also I think Ruth, what's interesting about the two parts of Ruth's education is that she has these very maybe more understandable qualms about the way she was educated in Catholic school. It's not as though she's totally like that, like her experience in art school is actually without its own shortcomings too. And so I think it's interesting, like she's able to, you know, she maybe she leaves home thinking like, oh, now that all that trouble is kind of behind me, and I can sort of have a good education that's self-expressive and embodies like all of these ideals. And then she goes to art school, and it's actually the people she encounters, there's a lot of like friction. It's like going to another country, honestly. And so I think it felt like it really fit the epigraph. And I love Kafka's Diaries. I love Kafka, and I'm glad that I found it when I did. Had I found it a few months later, it probably would not have made it into the book. So
I spoke with Weike Wang, the author of Rental House and Chemistry, and she told me that she does the same thing. And so that's immediately what I thought about when I saw this. She'll go back and she'll read like January 21st. Like, I was really sad today.
Yes,
It's so funny.
They're incredible.
It's so funny to think that like someone like him, like a total genius, could just truly like have such similar days to like, yeah, it's so funny to me. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about structure and process for a minute. I know you talked a little bit about like how this story came to you, but did you write it, like, did you outline and then did you write it sequentially as we read it? I know you said the first chapter came later, which makes sense because as soon as I did finish the book, I read the first chapter again, like immediately after.
Mm-hmm. All of the chapters they're fairly short chapters and they're of varying lengths, but I didn't really outline. I mean, I did have a sense of like the progression of the novel, how it would begin and how it would end more or less. The wonderful thing about writing a Bildungsroman is that unless you're doing something really like formally inventive, you are eight, then you become 9, then you become 10. It sort of like answers the question of chronology for you. Like it follows aging. And so I think that just naturally I wrote in a linear way because I was following the progression of these two girls. And then also I found it difficult to bounce back and forth because I think in order for there to be coherent and for the events to be everything to be accounted for and like for it to have like continuity, it's like whatever happens when they're 10 you need to know what has happened in order to write them when they're 25. I didn't want to go back into the beginning and go to the end like so much. Like I wrote it more or less chronologically, and I wrote in a linear way. And then of course like I added and removed things as I edited. But I think that it was fairly straightforward because I was just tracing their development, and I think it was apart from the opening chapter, which plays with time a bit. It was it's a fairly conventional structure.
Yeah, I really like what you said about needing to know what happened at age 10 to understand it happening at age like 25. I think you did that so well in this book, because one of the scenes that really struck me was when Ruth tells Maria at one point that she's careless. And this is still when they're kids. And she only says that because that's directly what her mom just told her. She said, you're careless. And so it just makes me think about how like our identities are formed with like whether we like it or not by our environments, and what we choose to take and what we choose to absorb later on in life. What made you really like want to write about that and touch on that?
Well, I mean, I guess part of it is about school. I was also thinking, to go back to the Kafka thing, like the harm, I think part of the harm education can do, or part of the harm that being raised in general. And like, some of what was reflecting on is the lack of agency that children are given. I think it's really unbelievable, like how much of your life is just like, you are just subject. You're kind of at the mercy of everyone around you, of caretakers, of teachers. And sometimes it can be wonderful if you are being treated well. But of course, there are countless situations where children are treated very badly, and they have no recourse. They have no ability to like, you can't, I mean, of course a child can emancipate themselves, but that's kind of a rare thing. And it's not even so much about child abuse, because it's sort of like these run of the mill things. Like I think everyone has had a situation where a teacher or a parent has scolded them and told them something critical that they've remembered well into adulthood, and I think that's what I was thinking of with the Kafka quote, but also with some of how like Ruth's kind of her what is the word, like porosity, or the fact that she's sort of like, she's very open to other people's characterizations of her. She immediately regurgitates whatever people say about her, and I wonder why some people are more susceptible to that than others. That you can just have a disposition that lends itself to being like very, very impressionable. Whereas someone like Maria, I mean, I'm sure she's getting, of course, we don't go home with her in the same way that we do with Ruth, because she doesn't narrate the book. But Maria is hearing all kinds of, critical things ostensibly about herself, but still manages to have like fairly high self-esteem, as she's not as willing to just take on like wholesale external opinions. And I think there are things that Ruth is, as an adult even, she's still clinging to like things that were said to her when she was, maybe 12 or and then also, I was going to say Moser, the character in the beginning in that opening section, he sort of says that for him, like his mother's abuse or like his mother's cruelty, it feels fresh. It will always feel fresh to him. He's like, an elderly man, and he's still sort of shaking when talking about his mother. And for him, it's sort of like, it's ever present. And I think I went to a talk once and someone was talking about their mother's death and saying that when he thinks about the death of his mother and like driving to finally see his mother see his mother's body when she's dead, he was saying that it's not something that can be described in the past tense. It's always in the present tense. It's kind of like an endless present. And I think that similarly, like we kind of carry our childhoods in that way, that it's endlessly present, even as it's further and further away by the day.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I've said before on the show and also talking to authors is that we're constantly coming of age, I think. I think we're always losing bits of our childhood and also mourning bits of it and also living with it constantly, no matter if we're going from childhood to adolescence, from adolescence to early adulthood. I think we're constantly coming of age. And I think that, especially thinking about how this book begins and ends with Ruth in her 40s, I think that's specifically an age, I think, for women really, where you're kind of just expected to know what you're doing and you're not really given any freedom to really reflect and figure out who you are anymore, because you should know, right? Or at least that's what society tells us, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I also think that it's her life is cemented in so many ways because she has like an enviable job, I'd say. Like she has the things that people covet and people want. And so I think part of it too is that early on, I also read an interview by an artist. I'm not going to say who it is, but it was this person talking about I think they were going to like a solo show that they had somewhere in Europe. And it was like supposed to be like a really, almost like a retrospective. And it was a huge accomplishment. It's like, what every artist, like that's the kind of professional accomplishment that is really people aspire toward and like really, really want. And she was talking about being deeply, deeply depressed and being so unhappy. And I was so surprised by like the candor and how open she was about not being like, you do these interviews and part of it is like doing performing, like accepting the congratulations and people and being happy about your success, which you should be. But obviously, like, I think people feel really ambivalent about their success, particularly artists, and about your professional life, because it's not only like a job that you clock in and clock out of. I know a lot of people's identity is bound to their professional life, but I think when it's something where the personal and professional are so intertwined, it's difficult to just feel happy. Or like, I think there's this real ambivalence about it. And I guess I was thinking with Ruth that she also is like, it's very somber in the beginning of the book, even though it's not only is she having this, did she have this very successful solo show, it's also her birthday. She's married to seems like she has a decent spouse and like she's more or less happily married. And it's like all of these things. I think it's like she's checked all of these boxes that obviously like it's doesn't mean that you'll be happy, whatever. But it was interesting to me that she seems just as lost and adrift as she was as like a teenager. And I think externally people are telling her like, are you okay? Why aren't you happy? You should be happy. It's a good time for you. And so, yeah, I think although, I'm speculating, I'm a bit younger than Ruth is when the novel opens. But I also do feel like, there's something a bit like unfair about the expectation that people be settled or become settled just because they've aged. It's like you can always be kind of untethered.
Absolutely. And that reminds me of one of my favorite lines in the book. I have it here, actually. Adults spend their lives trying to remember what they originally knew as children, and in the same breath, they dismissed children's insights. Do you remember writing that line? Can you talk to me a little bit about that? Because that truly is like my favorite one.
Thank you. Oh, that's I do remember writing it. I mean, I guess, the insight to me, I think it's because I don't have children yet, or like I don't have my relationship to children is that of like, I feel like I identify more with children than I do with adults in a way. Like, even though I feel, I don't know, I think it's maybe is just my sadness, the sadness I feel about children not being taken seriously, or like their low agency. And I'm like, oh, it's like sad to be a child and your concerns are seen as frivolous and like your point of view is like not respected or taken seriously. Even though I feel like the consensus is that like many painters and many writers say like to get back to a childlike state is like such a generative state for artists. Like you want to like paint or write with the wisdom of a child, even as like children are not taken seriously and are regularly dismissed. So I remember writing it. To me, that the idea just seems really self-evident. So I think that the sentence just came out of like that, the sense that it's just true.
Yeah, it's so funny to see how these different art forms strike people in different ways. Like that line really hit me. I was just because it made me think a lot about what you said about like the vulnerability of children and how they lack agency because we don't let them have any agency, and like they're really at the mercy of the people around them. And I think it's something that we can carry with us throughout any day, not just talking about this book, but like the next time I interact with a kid, like it's great to see how art first inspires other art, but also just the way that we live our lives. And there's also this idea of the American dream, I think, that runs through the novel, where Ruth and Maria are both the children of immigrants trying to make it in a country that's constantly othering them, whether it's through class, whether it's through race or culture or sexuality, also mental health as well. I mean, still, I think there's a stigma. I know there's a stigma still of othering people who suffer with mental health. And I loved that you touched on that in the book. And I just wondered why it was important for you to write about it and what you really want to do with it in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I guess as far as like the American dream thing, I think that, whatever problems you have that you're sort of like fleeing when you immigrate, there you bring them with you. And so I think it's not, and in some ways being in this country, I think can exacerbate those problems and make them actually just accelerate it just puts more stress on already stressful situations. And so I think about someone like Maria's aunt who raises her, like her Aunt Jocelyn, and it's like it's one thing to be mentally ill and to be kind of like surrounded by a culture that's like you and to have like relatives nearby. It's another thing, I think, entirely to be in the middle of like suburban New England by yourself, now raising a child, kind of trying to navigate the like weird bureaucracy of like American healthcare and then also like putting a child through school. And so I wanted, on one hand, like I think Jocelyn feels like a character who sort of embodies or holds like the real, like she's like doubly marginalized in a way. And I guess I maybe marginalized is the wrong word, but she's the sort of person that it's like she's not really visible, or like she's not legible to people around her, and she's sort of like shut away, or she's like a portrait of suffering and people. And even Ruth's mother at a certain point is like, she just looked awful in the grocery store. It seems like a problem without solution. So for whatever reason, I think maybe like Jocelyn seems like the clearest answer to that question, that there's like certain fantasies of like upward mobility, or, like coming to this country and making something out of yourself, and like that being a source of pride, but she doesn't have access to any of those, to that fantasy or that narrative at all. Jocelyn doesn't, because she's it seems as though things are actually only getting worse for her. And I think people are uncomfortable with the idea that a very true American story is that things just get worse and worse and worse for you, and institutions that are meant to help you, make you suffer more, and there's no recourse, and it's not inspiring, and it's not like, the story of like Jocelyn is not a life-affirming story. And I think the story of many people who come to this country, there are situations like arguably Ruth and Maria, it's like things worked for them the way they're purported to work. They were the recipients of like, or the way that people claim they work, and like they were the recipients of this charity. They ended up going to a good school. They found, success eventually, so on and so forth. But then there's the other story, which is of the failure of our American institutions to care for people who come to this country. And I think also now reading the book in light of what's happening now, I think it's like, oh, actually Jocelyn's story isn't sad enough. Like it's not sad enough to capture like how bad and extreme things are.
Yeah, and that's just a very unfortunate reality. And I think that's why we look toward art like books and movies and music and TV shows and also just visual art, because we're trying to make sense of these things happening all around us.
Mm-hmm.
Are you also a visual artist?
No, I'm not.
That's so surprising to me, because I love the way that you write about it in this book. How did you land on that then for Ruth's character?
Because when I finished college, I thought I would work in art. I worked at a museum. I worked for like this private art collection when I finished undergrad, and I just assumed that was the kind of work I would fall into. And so I think it was on my mind when I started writing the novel. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. Many of my friends are visual artists, and so I was interested in their world. And yeah, I think also I was becoming very disillusioned with art and like the prospect of maybe landing in like in a career where I would be surrounded by artists, even though I really do, it's something that I care about. I don't know, it had left a bad taste in my mouth or something. And so naturally, like, you write about what is like troubling you or what's on your mind. So yeah, but no, I'm not a visual artist at all. I don't know.
That's so surprising. Is it something that you think you'd ever try one day?
No, because I think if I sit down to do something and make work, I just think, well, I want to write fiction. I love writing fiction. So I don't,
Yeah.
I think you could probably put the materials in front of me, but if I had like I was left alone for 30 minutes, I'd probably just start writing again. So that's my
amazing.
fault.
That's amazing. I'd also love to talk a little bit about your influences. I'm guessing here, but I'm almost certain of it. You must be a student of just the Toni Morrison world of fiction. Like, yes, like so many great writers.
Yeah.
She was just
Yes.
incredible. One of the characters is reading Sula in this book, and this book reminded me a lot of Sula because Ruth and Maria's relationship reminded me in some ways of Sula and Nell's. And so I'd love to talk a little bit about influences and how that really like shows up in the book for you.
It's hard to say how Sula influenced me because I just love Sula so much. When a book is so influential like that, I mean, I read that book for the first time when I just started undergrad, and I just thought like, oh, you can actually distill a life in only maybe I think the book might be under 300 pages. It's a fairly short book, and I was talking with a friend recently about how short it is and how it could have been a much longer novel. And I've also heard people tell me that my novel could have been much longer than it is too. But I think an interesting project is trying to capture the life of two women in like this kind of compressed, space, like not making it like an epic, sprawling novel, but trying to achieve it in a way that's like very economical. And aside from that, I'll say just generally my influences. I feel very influenced by Jean Rhys. I feel very influenced by Gary Indiana and Toni Morrison. I would say are probably my biggest influences in terms of fiction. I really love John Ashbery too. I studied poetry before I studied fiction when I was at Bard, and so I think John Ashbery, although he's a poet, like he writes, it's not really in like. He writes sentences, he's like a language poet. And so I think that it's something about like the way that he uses colloquial language and also really elevated language too, that there's something sort of like conversational about his writing. But also I think like Kafka, there's something really mysterious and enigmatic about how simple the language can be. So I think that's very influential to me too. I mean, yeah, there's so much. I loved Corregidora by Gayl Jones. That's a book I reread as well while I was writing this novel. And that was edited by Toni Morrison too. And it was Gayl Jones' first novel. And it's also about an artist, although she's a singer, and about this really tumultuous relationship that she has. But yeah, I mean, I guess I like what I find influential, or like what I want to mirror with the books I read is like a kind of timeless quality. I don't want something to feel like, even though I care about capturing the zeitgeist or care about capturing like, the cultural moment that I'm in, I want to do it in a roundabout way because I don't want something to rely so much on you having been there or like winking at the reader or you needing to be online in a certain way. I want something that feels that like it could have been written at any time. And even a book like Horse Crazy by Gary Indiana, of course, like the context of AIDS is so important. And it's a book that you need to understand, I guess, more or less that AIDS is the backdrop of the novel, and that there's this like the romance is even more painful because it's kind of coming just after this cultural like there was such a loss, like people died in droves, and that's very important. But at the same time, I feel like that book could have been written 100 years before, and would have been just as much of an achievement, or like even could have been published today and would be a massive achievement. So I think that's something that I want to try to do, even as I write about the internet or like specific periods in history, to write something that feels like it could have been written anytime, by anyone, anywhere, or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That honestly perfectly leads me into my next question, because I have a quote here from James Baldwin. Every writer has only one story to tell, and he has to find a way of telling it until the meaning becomes clearer and clearer, until the story becomes at once more narrow and larger, more and more precise, more and more reverberating. So that quote is just incredible. But why do you think that this is the story that you needed to tell now? Why do you think that this had to be your debut?
Yeah, I mean, that I don't know, because I think the interesting thing is that when I was writing it, the thought of being here and like doing something like this now was so far away and unimaginable that I did not even and I think that sometimes does strike me, and it does really, it's just so surprising. It's so bizarre. I mean, when you asked me like, how does it feel to see someone hold your book? You're writing this thing like alone, without a sense of what it will become, or even if it will become anything, if you will sell it, will it be my debut? I had no idea when I was writing it that this would be my first novel. I thought, there's so many paths to like how people end up publishing and like end up as writers. And so I think there are some people, it's like they write 4 books before one of them is published. So I'm not sure. I mean, I guess I think that that's like what's it's kind of like ineffable why you are drawn to what you're drawn to. Like, you can't really say. I'm not sure. I mean, I think some of the biographical details, there are places I wanted to write about because there are the places that I'm from. It's not really an autobiographical novel, but yeah, I mean, I think it just accumulated, and I don't know why, God knows. But I do want to write something very different next time around. So I think maybe that's good advice, and I'm glad you shared that quote, because it doesn't have to be such a departure, like you can take some of, I think, I'm sure I'll just keep writing the same novel over and over again with different, in a different form. So,
well, it's funny because, I mean, we still read stories from hundreds of years ago, and we still relate to them now. I think as a people, we're constantly learning the same lessons over and over in different ways.
Yeah, of course.
So by the time this episode comes out, your book will be out in the world. It's only 2 weeks away from where we are right now.
Yeah.
Can you just tell me about how you're feeling and what the next 2 weeks look like for you until the pub date?
I feel good. Honestly, strangely, I feel pretty like level. I do think I'm hibernating a little bit and trying to shut myself away in order to feel kind of normal. I feel like I just want to write. I guess I don't want to get so, even though it's so exciting, and I'm so, I mean, even like this, like the questions have been so thoughtful. It's very kind that you took time to read the book and interview me. Anytime I do something like this, I think it's not something to just get over and like, worry about and fret about. Like it's like a huge gift, and I feel very appreciative. But I do just want to like not lose the kind of the closeness to my work, and just like the being alone with my work in the kind of more public facing part of things. So I feel good. I'm excited for the launch and to celebrate. And then I'm equally excited for a period of like real quiet after, where I can hopefully like continue writing. And
so are you working on the next thing?
I am working on the next thing. I'm working on a book. I mean, I'll only say the title because it's the one thing that hasn't changed, but it's called No Use. It's still, like really, I'm really still drafting it. And it is, yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit more humorous. Like it's a bit like a funnier book. Although I laugh a lot when I reread the book, and I think that my first novel, and I think there are parts of it where there is like real levity, and I think it's funny in some ways, but obviously it's a more like tragic story. So yeah, I mean, I'm trying to write something a bit lighter and something naturally. I go toward the sort of like the sort of heavy, somber thing. I think that's why I love Jean Rhys so much. I think Jean Rhys is incredibly funny, but is a very sad writer. But yeah, I'm working on it, and I'm trying to again shut myself away in the next 2 weeks a bit so I can like spend some time with it.
Well, I will be waiting patiently for this next book. I will say I instantly became a fan of yours. I will absolutely be waiting for this next book. So like I said, by the time this episode comes out, readers will be able to go grab their own copy of Lonely Crowds. I adore this book. I can't wait to get into readers' hands. Stephanie, thank you so much for this conversation today.
Thank you. I had the best time. Talk soon. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.